Hello, welcome to today's webinar in Knowledge Miles, which is the lectures associated with the 695th Lord Mayor of London. In this series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, what the current Lord Mayor, Michael Magnelli, calls the world's coffee house, and how these might help us tackle future global challenges. Today's lecture is the Achilles heel of AI, how a major tech risk to your business could be one you haven't heard of and what you should do. And the sponsor is the Open Data Institute. My name is Richard Harvey. I'll be convening this session and moderating the Q&A. If you're curious, I'm a professor of computer science at the University of East Anglia, and I'm a former professor at Gresham College, hence the connection with the City of London. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping from me. This is today's agenda, which you can see is commendably simple and brief. Without further ado, however, let me introduce today's speaker, who is sort of computer science royalty, really, I guess. I mean, it's Sir Nigel Shadbolt, FRS, who has a list of affiliations and letters after his name, which are simply too long. Even if I spent time summarizing the letters, that would take me too long. I think he's really here in his capacity as chair of the Open Data Institute. I'll post some links to his impressive CV in the chat as we go through, so you can have a look at that and be impressed as the rest of us will be. Right, that's enough from me, I think. Time to hand over to today's speaker. Over to you, Nigel.
Thank you very much, Richard. That was very, 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 very kind of you, and it's great to be talking to you all today. I'm delighted to be giving this talk. I'm going to rattle through a number of slides just to set a context, and then looking forward to questions. Let me just start straight away. I've got the benefit of 3 additional minutes, given that Richard's introduction was so commendably brief. So the Achilles heel of AI. I have a number of hats. I am chair and a co-founder of the Open Data Institute, along with Tim Berners-Lee back in 2012. I'm also a professor in computer science here at Oxford, and have been working in AI for a long time, decades and decades, which makes me old. I don't know about royalty, but old certainly. Just a few things, and this may be absolutely obvious to a number of you, I suspect, watching or listening to this lecture. But I think it's important to just remind us that AI is not new. It can trace its roots right back to the earliest days of computer science. Turing himself laid the foundations for our subject in the late 1930s with his extraordinary work on computability and universal Turing machines. Then, of course, went to Bletchley, gave us the bomb, the ability to actually decrypt encrypted intelligence signals. And in the 1950s, he found himself at Manchester, and there's a picture of him there on this slide, with the Manchester Mark I. And indeed, he was imagining, even with these very simple computers, he foresaw the trajectory of development of computing and imagined what that world might look like. And in his paper that appeared in Mind, a philosophy journal in 1950, he actually put forward the imitation game, now known as the Turing test, in which he imagined a machine so capable that you wouldn't know from your interactions via a teletype, as he imagined it at the time, or some interaction method. Actually, he saw it as passing messages back and forth between something on the other side of us in another room, whether that was a machine or a human. That test he thought would be a suitable test for intelligence. We may well have changed our minds in intervening years, particularly since we've now got systems that are pretty able to do that. But Turing was at the beginning of what was then called machine intelligence. In 1956, it rechristened itself at the Dartmouth Conference to artificial intelligence, and that's the name we've given to this emergent set of approaches and methods in computer science and mathematics and statistics. It's not just machine learning. We talk now an awful lot about machine learning as a very important paradigm in what we do. But AI consists of many techniques, and here is a number of them on this slide, giving you a sense of the depth and range of techniques. They're going to turn out to be quite important, I think, as we move forward, because we're already seeing a need to blend some of our machine learning methods with more traditional forms of so-called symbolic AI, rule-based reasoning, logic-based systems, which are able to add particular sorts of rigor over the reasoning that you might want to use these systems for. It's also been around, not just for many decades. AI has been in use, in production use, in many, many contexts. In our smartphones for decades, in our systems that we use in trading very often, in the manufacturing world, in leisure, in games, and in various forms of defense and offense. So AI is ubiquitous and pervasive. But of course, it's come dramatically to our attention. Why? Well, I think because sort of straightforwardly, modern AI is able to have extended conversational exchanges with its users. And this was really something of a wake-up moment. AI is now a field that's on everybody's lips, on everybody's investor decks, on everybody's kinds of technology roadmaps. It's quite, I find it quite interesting to look back on the moment when I myself sort of realized that we had almost gone through an inflection point. Back in 2020, I'd first come across a number of these large language models. They're not as large as they are now, but they were working in essentially the same way. And shortly after, I was involved in writing a book with other people in the field of AI. And as part of that book, James Manika, who is the now the senior vice president at Google, had come up to me and shown me a series of responses to an Oxford College's entrance exams. A system called Da Vinci, a successor to a GPT-3 model, was providing answers to All Souls entrance exams, and they were compelling questions, answers to questions such as, does Kant successfully refute Hume's skepticism? There is no Marx without Lenin. Discuss. Do Gödel's incompleteness results show that the mind is not well modeled as a computer? All of these prompts, questions, elicited coherent, sustained answers from a system trained on very large amounts of content from the web. And not only that, the systems were able to generate code. It was pretty clear that at some point when these systems were announced, they were going to take the world of business and academia by storm. Let's just spend a little bit of a moment thinking about how these systems just broadly work. This is OpenAI's GPT, large language model. Just to say then, the graphics you're seeing, what you're essentially seeing are two aspects, so-called encoding, where the system, the network, is trained on very, very large amounts of data from the web, with the simple, apparently simple, but an extraordinarily impressive piece of engineering to predict the next most likely word, or the next most likely token, to accurately say. And from that, predicting from a massive corpus of ingested content, the system is able to generalize to predict the next most likely sensible word in an extended context of output. The model we're looking at, GPT-3, was fed at the time with many large amounts of data, and on the order of 175 billion parameters, that is essentially representations in the network architecture for how to compute the next most likely token. The thing that really, I think, impressed researchers was an increasing set of results from this kind of architecture, that size mattered. So when Google launched its pathways to language model, PaLM, its large language model, what it was able to demonstrate was a scaling law. On the left, you can see a graph that essentially shows you performance against benchmarks. Benchmarks turn out to be hugely important test questions you put to these systems across a wide range of domains. Linguistic reasoning, logical reasoning, word meaning, sentence completion, a whole set of different tasks that these systems were being evaluated against. And on the left, you see performance against those models of a variety of model types. And the bottom, you see essentially a measure of the size of the models themselves, the networks themselves. And you can see that that graph seems to be demonstrating a slope of increasing power or effectiveness as the models get larger. And as you move from tens of millions to billions to hundreds of billions of nodes in these systems, you effectively increase performance. The other dramatic feature of this system was, and at this point, the companies were releasing quite a lot of detail about how these systems were trained and the content that had been trained across, is the sheer amount of content that was needed to train this model. Something like 780 billion tokens in this case, of which to get content training, language content at that scale, you're going to have to take what's out there on the web. And a huge majority of that was in fact social media conversations, multilingual, different languages, but 50% of the data from that source. Filtered web pages, books, online repositories of code, Wikipedia. Notice Wikipedia, actually quite a small amount in terms of the amount of data, about 4%, turns out to have had an outsized effect on the quality of output. If you remove these resources from the original training, you get disproportionate effects in terms of the fidelity of output. And if you're going to train a model on literally huge amounts of social media content, you have to spend a long time detoxifying it, removing the bias, problematic responses. And indeed, that's one of the hidden features of many of these large language models, the amount of filtering that's happening in the background. These models started to perform increasingly well as they got bigger. So OpenAI's GPT-4, the successor to 3, started to show clear improvements on a whole range of professional exams to which it was put, and so on. And along with that, a set of improvements have come into view about how you take the large language model. In this graph, we're seeing something called essentially retrieval augmentation, where the models don't just deal with the stuff they've been trained on, but they're given additional resources such as knowledge graphs, which are descriptions, explicit descriptions of up-to-date knowledge or specialized information area to enrich the response of the large language model. So this sets the context for a really exciting set of capabilities in AI. And we have seen the huge amount of attention that's flown from that. But in 2023, a paper appeared, actually some of it from colleagues of mine here in Oxford and other researchers, that showed the possibility of what we refer to as model collapse. And this is the fact that imagine a world in which these models are subsequently retrained on data which the models themselves have produced. And the example in this slide on the top right-hand side, you can see some text that is being generated, and then a generation on, it's being trained on the output of the previous generation of a model. And through time, you get a deterioration in the output of the model. The essential idea here is that one has to be very careful of a world which many think we may already moved into, in which large amounts of the content on the web is itself machine generated, perhaps increasing amounts of it by these large language models. The paper actually explains other features of this model collapse. One of the things it will also tend to do, if you're feeding it output from a previous generation of learning, is it will tend to skew the distribution of events as they occur in the world. So probable events are overestimated and improbable events are underestimated, essentially a regression to the mean. And this is potentially harmful in many, many contexts in which the tail of a distribution, the limits of a distribution, those improbable events become important. There's increasing interest in this topic, and you're seeing it in both the popular reporting around this area, but also in scientific papers that are starting to appear. Strange things start to happen when you ingest your own content. I should say deterioration of content, not deterioration of content, deterioration of content. And this wonderful phrase from a group working at Stanford, which is MAD, model autophagic disorder. Autophagic loops are self-consuming loops. In fact, it's a very elegant way of describing the feeding in from previous generations into a new cycle of learning of generated AI content. And in fact, in the image on the right, you can see artifacts being introduced into images that are a product of this autophagic loop. So the question we face is, in a world in which potentially increasing amounts of content are machine generated, how are we to guard for the importance of well curated, originally provenanced data? So just to say a few words on that, I think it brings us back to one of the key missions, in fact, of the Open Data Institute, which is why we were very keen to kind of support and sponsor this talk. The importance of data has been recognized in all sorts of earlier contexts. We think we understand that in many, many sectors in data science and in the work we do. But in the sense in which the data being ingested by these models, much of the training data will have been open data. That is still contested. Some people are arguing over whether data has been appropriately or inappropriately harvested from the web. But assuming that a large amount of it was accessed as open data, the important thing is, what is the quality of that data? And more importantly, do we have capabilities to recognize what good quality data is? Do we have a view that this data constitutes an important infrastructure in the technologies we build and deploy? Do we have methods to assure it? Do we have institutions to care and manage and improve it? And do we have appropriate governance, regulation, and ethics around not just the AI, but around the underpinning data? The image there is the work that we've done over the years at the ODI to explain that, of course, data isn't just one kind of thing. It comes in many varieties and strains, from open data, which can be absolutely reused, to shared and closed data. Much of the data that will be being used in these RAG systems, the knowledge graphs that will be used that are local to a particular company, may well contain data that is quite carefully curated, quite carefully maintained and retained. But we should be thinking about whether our own organizations will begin increasingly to rely on machine-generated data, and whether that could or might introduce these problems of potential model collapse and pollution of the data space. There's a lot of work going on this area, and we've made it a key theme within our own work at the ODI. Our summit in 2023 talked about the importance of good quality data for good and effective AI. And indeed, a very recent report from the Tony Blair Institute was talking about the importance of data in one of the key pillars where AI might be applied in health and in how we might think about managing that as a national resource. So the importance of data is recognised. It's recognised in the UK's own international tech strategy. You can see there on the right-hand side of the diagram, a low quality data and availability driven by legacy systems, a lack of data infrastructure, or of mechanisms for responsible data sharing. All of that messaging that we were very keen to promote, and something that the UK clearly understands, but it's how that's materialized in the work we do and in our approach to data management. It needs to be properly stewarded. There's not enough good data out there. How do we generate? And we're almost imagining a world in which there's a pre-generative AI and a post-generative AI, where we were largely assured that a good amount of data was still being generated using methods that often had humans in the loop. So what are we to do? Well, strong and trustworthy data infrastructures. That's something we need to invest in. It needs stewardship. It needs organizations to understand and recognize how they marshal data and evaluate it against high standards of quality and usability. It requires that we understand the biases that might be available. Again, this is quite a well understood and commented on problem in data science and AI, the problem of bias in machine learning data sets, but it's a new manifestation where we're looking at machine generated content providing much of the training data. We need to think about the openness of data sources, that quality counts, and that in our large language models, we still have a great deal of research to do to understand the impact of different strains and types of data on performance. Assurance, I've talked about, that codes of conduct, standards about its assessment is a key area, we believe, where we think there's going to be a whole new set of professional activities around assuring and managing data. We think that requires a broad cross-sectoral approach, and I think we're going to be seeing that come through in some of the work that I'll refer to right at the end on governance. And we need ethical use and equitable use of this data, even as it's being used in these large language models. We have to think about what have these systems been trained on. There is already some concern about an equity split between global north and global south, that a great deal of the data that's been harvested is disproportionately representative of particular geographies and particular economic systems. And of course, the perennial problem of understanding and developing skills and literacy around these issues. Even as systems like Copilot are deployed by Microsoft, where generative AI is helping inform and direct everything from the construction of PowerPoint slides to the summarization of Teams meetings to advice around structuring and presenting documents, we do need to understand the limits and conditions of these large language models, what their inherent behaviors are, and how we might notice them and be alert for them. And a final, perhaps, reflection on governance. As we speak, there in Seoul, in South Korea, the UK is co-chairing, along with the South Korean government, the follow-up to the Bletchley Summit, where, in fact, there is real progress toward thinking about how different countries might get together to agree norms and behaviors around AI. Different approaches, from the EU's AI Act through to the pro-innovation approach that the UK is taking, where it's going to be making more use of regulatory bodies, through to bilateral agreements. The UK and the US, they have gotten the AI Safety Institute and NIST in the US to work collaboratively on working through ways in which we can ensure the safety of these large language model systems. The interim report produced by the by the UK to put into this, and taking wide international input from the scientific community, is a really quite balanced document on the risks and the opportunities, but also the processes we might need to put in place as we deploy this technology. And although I do think this issue of data quality is still something of an unrecognized challenge, because it seems to perhaps belong somewhere else, but it's absolutely the heart of how we're going to make these systems effective. And if people are interested in following through some of the principles that I think are important in managing a well-organized and regulated AI future, then there is this book which has just come out, As If Human, Ethics and Artificial Intelligence, where we try and lay out some precepts, not just for the dangers around model collapse, but essentially in how we ensure that the AI systems of the future embody the best values that we as humans would like to expect from one another, and indeed from our technology. Thank you very much.
Oh, excellent. Excellent, Nigel. Yeah. Very
So
interesting place to stop. Let me. I'm going to ask the first. I'm going to ask the first question. It's it's a privilege, so I shall do so. So, okay, that was really thought-provoking. And what about the other way round? So you said, well, as if human. What can humans learn from machines? While you were talking, I was thinking about the mountains of Kong, which was this mysterious mountain range that in the 1800s was said to run all the way across Africa. And it wasn't there at all. And presumably generations of school children were told by people who'd been told about the mountains of Kong. There are no mountains of Kong. And this is humans absorbing their own Kool-Aid, isn't it?
Yeah.
So my question is, it's not very well put, is it? My question is, do you think that the things that you are talking about learning about the way machines do learning could help us humans learn?
Look, I mean, it's a great point. It's not as if we're immune from confabulation, hallucination, or the injection of false models of how the world really is. But I think this is a particular interesting source of potential danger with generative AI. I think it's absolutely plausible to imagine that there are aspects of the way in which systems fail and the way in which humans fail that could actually inform one another. One of the most interesting ways in which you can, I think, put AI to work is to regard it as an augmentation, or as a critiquing system, or as a pause for thought system. It isn't that the systems have to always be the fountain of the core answers to questions, and that used in this slightly critiquing model or Socratic model, it's a very interesting thought, and I think that's right, Richard. We shouldn't just fall into one modality of thinking about where we get insights.
Okay, well, that little question was enough to, as usual, set the questions alight from the audience, which is wonderful. I'd like to sort of pick up a couple of those. So thinking about identification of machine-generated content, is it possible to accurately identify machine-generated content as it gets more sophisticated, so you don't fuel this paradigm? Asks Paul MacDonald.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the question that's being asked at the moment. I think there are at least two aspects. One is you could insist that the good actors in this space absolutely conform to a principle of marking their content as AI generated if it is, or if you're talking to the chatbot, the thing should sort of say what it is and be what it says, essentially. So you're not dissembling. The other challenge, of course, is how you deal with the deliberate attempt to dissemble, or to the deep fake kind of tradition. Will watermarking actually be, for example, a solution here? And there is actually the report I was just referring to does touch on the issue of whether or not there are ways of technically inserting really quite robust watermarking signatures into AI generated content. There's a bit of a split of views on this. It's certainly something that deserves serious attention. I think clearly systems that are being devised to help identify deep fakes of various sorts. So this is always a kind of an arms race in some sense. You're looking for one to outbid the other. But norms and regulations about what you must reasonably do to make best efforts to indicate this content is machine generated, that's absolutely got to be a starting point. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, Faith Elizabeth Lilly asks, what are your thoughts about intentional efforts to poison data on the internet, which you were just talking about there? Although primarily around images, he says, I see a lot of this discussion around art.
Yeah.
And I suppose there are 2 points that you're making here. One is the deliberate and malicious attempt to poison data that will affect innocent AI, if you see what I mean. And
Yeah.
but the other one you were talking about, I think, which is an unintentional design flaw, perhaps, which is the believing your own Kool-Aid. If that's
Yeah, and I think it's an awareness that that's a possibility, which is super important, and what you might do to certainly caution or indeed mitigate those challenges. I think the first point, I mean, there is a real issue around data poisoning. I mean, it's been there since the earliest days of neural networks, so-called backdoor attacks, where you could leave vulnerabilities in systems which just were not apparent until you realized that there were these trigger patterns which could completely throw the system's classification off. So there's quite a lot of work to look at here, but it's got to be a concern. I think one thing it points to is the really interesting role that trusted institutions will have in managing and curating high quality data sets. And you talk about art, and will it become more, not less important, for institutional assurance that this content in some sense is authentic and not mucked around with. Yeah. But there will need to be a range of responses. And I think the point is to be thinking about those now.
And Hugh Purser asks, what happens if you restricted the data sourcing process by weighting the sources? Keep social media down to a very small percentage and go up to something more reliable. Perhaps I could sort of broaden that a bit, Nigel, and say what you'd hope in the future, I suppose, is that AI would be able to make its own judgments about what is a reliable source. Is that unrealistic, do you think?
I think that is a great point. The increasing interest around what's now called agentic AI, which is, and it's an old idea in AI, it's the idea that you treat AI systems as agent-based systems and you equip them with a set of tactics or mechanisms to deal with the world as they find it. And the idea of these systems being critical of the content they have in, and it's a little bit like the kind of skills we attempt to teach here in our universities, which is the art of critical self-reflection, or a critical mindset on any content you're looking at or argument that's being made. And I think there's technology you could think to develop here, and there is also this notion that we do. Again, perhaps want to think about whether trusted resources become particularly valued, or are there ways of marking provenance or chain of provenance of material and lines of argumentation in a way that makes it more amenable to scrutiny and evaluation?
Mm. I mean, I was wondering, I'm sure you've had, oh, I'm sure you won't have had this experience, but I have had this experience, which is being completely and utterly wrong about something. And you can feel your mind doing a rewrite as you have to reprogram all those neurons. And you think, oh, so this happened, this happened, this happened.
I'd like to think. I mean, that of course is the brilliant thing about science as well. We're always, this is a great phrase, standing on the edge of error. So you're meant to have a self-correcting mechanism, which is when you put your hypothesis and the world finds you wrong or out, you're meant to revise your beliefs, and that belief revision happens in lots of contexts. I think it's super important that we allow for our systems to go through that process. I mean, we're already doing that in the context of this so-called RAG approach, where you can update a model that was trained on the facts as they were 2 years ago with newer facts. The trouble is the tracing through all the consequences of that new context can be quite tricky. My favorite example is a system that might have been trained at the time we had another prime minister can be kind of updated to that particular fact. But if you ask the system whether or not who the prime minister's spouse is, it hasn't worked that network connection out, and it might be the wrong answer back the earlier. So there's a whole set of complexity around how knowledge interconnects, how we revise, as you say, rewire the neurons or the representation of what facts we believe and don't believe.
I understand. So Emma Thwaites asks a bit more about this. She says, I'd like to know more about the ideas around model collapse. Could this lead to whole AI systems, even businesses, collapsing?
I think that's, I think that the awareness of this issue is now becoming more widely appreciated, I think, within people who do this training work. And they're beginning to think about, how do we respond? How do we make it more resilient? How do we, exactly the ideas we've been talking about, ensure a safe haven or a quality control method for the information and data ecosystem. But without some careful management, without some thought in this, some critical reflection, systems that were just allowed to rip on generations of machine generated content might find themselves in a difficult situation. I think the output of these systems would become fairly quickly apparently not desirable, and then the question is, what is the actual cost of redeploying systems which are more carefully trained and managed? That's the question I think we need to be looking at soon. Yeah.
So John Fitzgerald asks, does the future of quality AI look like more specialized tools with more explicit information on their limitations?
I think that'll definitely be an area that will develop. You're already seeing it in a sense with specialized models that are fine-tuned to particular areas or given additional knowledge resources, so they become super capable in particular task areas, whether that's health or trading or whatever that might be. And it's also happening because people are looking at these very large models and trying to work out what subset or what can we make that model much sparser, much smaller, and still get most of the benefit that we had. So a combination of trying to make them more compact and potentially efficient and more finely tuned. I think that's definitely an area that we're going to see develop. It is developing right now. Yeah.
And Shani Morris asked a question to which I hadn't really given much thought, but I'm sure you know the answer. And I'm going to paraphrase it because it's quite long, but it says, a basic problem is that some AI might get something wrong about an individual. Now, what's their redress? Do they have legal redress? And how can you have redress against these systems?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it speaks to quite a deep issue in the way in which a lot of regulation and a lot of assumptions are made about the output of computational systems, of algorithms. It's come up in the context of the Horizon scandal, for example, with the post office system, that this overly confident weighting in the output of algorithms often two things happen. One, people say, well, humans make errors anyway, but that's not the point. What is the redress you have in that situation? And I think it will depend on the kind of strength of the regulatory bodies you have. So, one of the regulators in the US that has significant powers in this area is the Federal Trade Commission, which is there to kind of detect deceptive or discriminatory practices. If you're subject to an injury or some kind of impact as a result of algorithmic processing, there has to be a redress. And the question then is how you trace accountability back to to who ultimately is going to stand in place of making that redress.
Mm. And I think Pauline Roche has got one of these wonderful little punchy questions, which is a good leaping off point, which is what institutions would Nigel list as trusted? Because I think you refer to trusted institutions. And
Yeah,
if I
yeah,
could
yeah. Well,
expand that a little bit, Nigel, because obviously we're very interested in the ODI, but at the root of it is indeed, I suppose, trusted sources.
yeah.
So
Well, in
how would
fact,
you
the
do it?
ODI itself is very interested in that question of what does a well-managed, equitable, and effective and trustworthy data ecosystem look like? Where do you go for a higher set of standards around the data that's held and used and maintained? And when we talk about wanting institutions to build and invest in their data infrastructures, it's precisely around this kind of question. Where would you go? I mean, again, traditionally, we've liked to think that certain of our national institutions or academic institutions at least attempt to work to a level where the standard of proof or the standard of evidence is high. You can always find examples in science but I would, an institution like the Royal Society, which I happen to be proud to be a member, or the Royal Academy of Engineering. These institutions work hard to promote and understand where quality data and where quality opinions and outputs sit in the world. It's not people would say trusted institutions like public broadcast institutions who can say the National Archives, Office for National Statistics, statutory organizations that play an important role. There's the interesting question about self-correcting organizations like Wikipedia. I mean, again, it's an interesting point that at the core of Wikipedia's millions of articles, there's this very stable set of content, which, while some people may feel they contest it, has quite high authority, and working out where and how that locates. And I think it's a huge opportunity for businesses to become the trusted repositories for high quality data, some of which they choose to make open, is going to be a really important feature for well
Yeah,
organized economies going forward.
yeah, no, you're right. There's a number of businesses that have their USP is almost that. I mean, in thinking of image companies,
Yeah.
some companies that you just are very trusting of. Maybe we need a sort of data rating agency, a bit like a credit rating agency.
Or the,
Which
or the Lloyd's Register, whatever it might be, people whose job is the assurance and authentication of the data about other important artifacts in our world. Yeah, yeah.
it doesn't mean you wouldn't make mistakes, does it? But it means
No.
you correct them quickly and you be transparent about them and so on. Yeah, great idea. And I noticed at the end of your talk, you were talking a little bit about the British government, the UK government sort of activities in this area led by the Prime Minister. And I felt sort of fairly optimistic when you were talking, and pleased that I was a citizen of the United Kingdom. Should I be? Are we doing? Is the UK doing a good job? Do you think?
I think it's making really serious efforts to coordinate and respond. It sits in this interesting position between, if you like, a rather more libertarian US view of how it wants to organize things, and perhaps an EU disposition towards kind of always trying to find a law that fits the situation. So, in a sense, the common law code, which is a kind of show us the harm principle, can be quite a helpful basis to start from. But it's also trying to do more than that. It's trying to get on a front foot. What are the issues that will arise? The task force that was put together that helped to organize the Bletchley Summit, the AI Safety Institute that's been established, are all attempts to seriously understand the kinds of risks, the sorts of mitigations, the processes we might need in place as these general artificial intelligence systems become available. I think one thing that I quite like is the move away from worrying too much about self-aware supercomputers that put away with us, the AGI, artificial general intelligence, to this idea of general artificial intelligence. These are systems that can be repurposed in many different tasks by tuning and refinement. So I think there's a lot to look at in the way the UK is trying to organize itself and take a leadership position that we should be pleased about. I think there's some coordination of the landscape still to do. There are quite a few players in this who kind of need to make some common cause on this. But no, I think it's serious about it, and I believe going forward, I'd hope that the history of work, both in computer science, data science, artificial intelligence in this country, both public and private, gives us a good basis for that.
It's all we've got time for. It's so annoying. And there was a wonderful question at the end by Pauline. Actually, I might have mispronounced her surname. She could be a German. She might be Roca rather than Roche. She says, one profession whose job it is to identify trustful sources is librarians. So
Yes.
I hear to that. Yeah, everyone loves librarians. There's
a lot to learn from the information scientists.
Yeah, I know those guys. They always run the best quiz team, don't they? Right. That really is all the time we've got for, ladies and gentlemen. Far too many questions for me to get to Nigel. So thank you very much to the audience. It's a wonderful audience, which is always very lively. This lecture and all our lectures are recorded and posted on a YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit anything. And we certainly look forward to seeing you again. If you enjoyed this sort of thing, then you might enjoy the other City of London's free lecture resource, which is Gresham College, which also has a very impressive YouTube channel, as does Zien, who sponsor these meetings. So thank you very much. Last thank you to Sir Nigel. Excellent talk, very thought-provoking. I know you're super busy, so special thanks. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.